talk to me a little more about Bukele's rise to power. It's actually kind of significant visiting here even just a few months apart and seeing how much infrastructure has been built, how many hotels and buildings have been completed, and actually how stable the country's remained, right?
Correct.
This is not a temporary fix. This is a long-term solution. I want to talk to you about Bukele's rise to not just power, but to prominence on the global stage. And El Salvador's incredible recovery that seems so natural, but also it feels like it's only the beginning. You've been here for a very, very long time, Herbert. You've been here since you were a child. Talk to me a little bit about what the El Salvador looked like before Bukele, the El Salvador that you grew up in.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, Elijah. It's truly a pleasure to be here and to talk about the progress that we're seeing in El Salvador. El Salvador in the past lived in a very, very dark situation in which families could not send their children to school. People could not open their businesses because they would be murdered. They would be kidnapped. They would be extortioned. Quite often, we would see situations in which they would even board public transport to mug everyone on board, regardless if they were old or if they were young, regardless. And if the people didn't pay, they would set the whole public transport bus on fire, killing dozens of victims at once. This was common practice by the satanic gangs that once ruled over El Salvador before President Bukele. What we're seeing now in El Salvador is a nation that's healing, a nation that has been given a future that had been taken away by the corrupt politicians of the past who never cared about the well-being of El Salvador or its people. They only cared about being in power. They only cared about the allegiances they had to foreign interests that wanted to keep El Salvador in a state of permanent conflict. Now with President Bukele, we see how this has completely changed for the best. President Bukele has not only restored our democracy, our sovereignty, but he has restored the patriotism within the hearts of every Salvador.
Well, and let's talk about that. I mean, I don't want to get you in trouble, but I have to say, I went past the embassy, the United States Embassy. It was pretty damn big. I mean, it was looked like a State Department for the nation. And this is not the United States. And it's no secret that the United States, the CIA, and our intelligence have had a lot of action, especially through the Cold War in Central and South America. Some of it the United States population agrees with. Some of it they disagree with, and others of it they probably don't even know about. But, some of the groups that were involved in this, you mentioned to me earlier that, there's about 30 years of corruption, of gang violence that sort of culminated to this El Salvador that the Americans are so familiar with, the place where people are murdered and are mugged. This is sort of the vision that Americans still have of this place. The average American who's not up to date, doesn't go on the news, they still think that this is a third world country where Americans should not go, right? It's like Cuba or some nation like North Korea, and that's really what they feel. And so, when you look back and you grow up and you were growing up, who were these groups that over 30 years were making El Salvador an unlivable place for the people? A combination, was it gangs? Was it governments? Was it ideologies like communists? I mean, who were these people?
Look, I will tell you something, Elijah. El Salvador considers the United States its greatest ally, and they have been, and they continue to be. What I will say is that there always exists a interest from globalist elites around the world. It doesn't necessarily have to limit itself to the continent of America. It can come from other continents as well, that seeks to maintain Latin American countries in a constant state of chaos. Why is this, you might ask? This is because if a country is in chaos, not only is it easy to control, but it's also very easy to do illicit business. Like, for example, if order is restored in Latin America, what does that mean? That means that hordes of illegal immigrants will no longer head towards the north. That means that cartels will no longer be able to use these countries to transport their drugs towards the north. Therefore, if you restore order in Latin America, you are hindering the interests of many criminal structures, most of the time international criminal structures, that seek to use these countries as pawns to be able to operate. But now that leaders like President Bukele are rising, This puts El Salvador in a position that sets a positive example for neighboring countries. It shows neighboring countries that they don't have to be subordinates to anyone. They deserve to be treated with respect. They deserve to be treated as sovereign nations. And President Bukele has done a very good job at restoring, reclaiming our sovereignty as a nation. El Salvador is no longer a bridge for cartels. El Salvador is no longer a hive for criminal structures, and it certainly will never serve international interests ever again.
And it's an interesting thing that you bring up because, it's not just Central America and South America that serve as a bridge. I mean, you have the no borderland, right? Ukraine, that's currently just seen as a conduit for NATO and for, Western Europe to sort of wage this, war of civilizations on Russia, sort of like what the United States has been warring this war on terror, right? This neocon battle where countries are sort of caught the split hairs of a much larger issue. And it seems like El Salvador, for better or for worse, had just been used as a pawn and that it lacked identity. But the people here are very resilient, I've noticed that. But there's something strange that I want to ask you about. I talk to the people here and they cry to me in vehicles. They cry to me on the street, and they're not drunk. Sit at the bar. They're sober individuals, hardworking people, telling me how much their life has changed. How many thousands of dollars they were being extorted from these criminal cartels. And I want to get into the actual discussion as we're talking about the history here of the gangs, of the occult, of the true brutality of what was happening here, so people get a understanding of really what Bukele is up against, what the people have been up against, and why they believe in him. And I want to do that because people somehow think that Bukele is like Kim Jong-un or he's some, Maduro or some dictator that's forcing or imposing his will upon the people. And that's not what I'm seeing here. And I don't think that's true. So let's talk about this extortion and what the gangs were doing on the ground. What was life like for an average El Salvadoran in terms of their interactions with the gangs? And I'm not talking about cartels, the drug trade. I mean, an average Joe just trying to pay for his kids, to eat. What was life like for them as a small business owner in the country?
Absolutely. All right, let's start here. There's two answers to your question. First, let's start with what it used to be like in the past. In the past, the moment you opened a business, whether it was a little convenience store, a little restaurant, whatever, you name it, you would get a knock on your door by a gang member who would come and collect his weekly allowance or his weekly rent, as they used to call it. This could range anywhere from $100 to $200, which is a lot of money in El Salvador. And if you did not pay the amount that they requested, they wouldn't come over and break your window. No, they would literally come in broad daylight and shoot you or one of your relatives or employees right in the face in front of everyone and get away with it. Because our legal system in the past was absolutely broken. It was designed to keep El Salvador in a state of chaos. These gang members committed atrocious murders. They would go in, and due to a supposed lack of evidence, which was simply not true because sometimes they were even on camera, they would be released because they would threaten the judges. And if that was not the case, maybe they belonged to higher structures that allowed them to rope free. And now we are seeing a justice system that is not only functional and effective, but has healed an entire nation. If it weren't for President Bukele, we would still be living in the chaos El Salvador had to endure in the past. Children couldn't go to school. There's very humble communities that have to send their children to school on foot. Sometimes these kids would not come back home. Sometimes they wouldn't even make it to their school. And another thing worth mentioning, a lot of the times, these schools weren't even schools. They weren't even proper structures. They were literally a little wooden shack that the governments of the past called an investment in education. But in reality, they were stealing the money and they weren't giving anything to the people. Now you see how President Bukele is building schools on a daily basis, proper structures, first world structures, to give our children and our future generations dignity. You see how people are opening businesses. You see how tourism's coming in, which is helping finance these businesses. You see a complete change that would not have been possible had President Bukele not been strong and firm against the international globalist system that wanted to oppose progress.